Stephen, that is, the young James Joyce, strove to pierce to the significant heart of everything. What a beautiful line that might stand for the genuine artist's credo and his cross. Welcome to the Omphalos Cafe and my ongoing series of videos on James Joyce's monumentally misunderstood classic, Ulysses. And make no mistake, the deeper I delve into this project, the more I ponder and ruminate upon it, the more I realize how utterly lacking in what might be termed poetic insight all that passes for scholarship and learning upon Joyce and his works appear. As a result, Ulysses has been wrung completely dry of its living, dynamic core, analyzed to irrelevance, deconstructed to death, and, ironically, that's the very modern sickness and paralytic plight, our modern sickness and paralytic plight, that is. The two principal male characters, Stephen and Bloom, are striving manfully to transcend. Now I say the two principal males because through the course of the day Molly, in the integrity of her womanhood, proves herself immune to the almost universal sickness and plight. Perhaps that's a result of not having too much education. She above all stands out as whole and fully immersed and participant in the flow of life. Anyway, there you have it. The almost total disconnect between what is going on here at the cafe and what you are fed virtually everywhere else. Bloomsday, that is reason, intellect, analysis, scholarship, and academia, is truly for the masses. Whereas Dedalusday, poetic insight and an opening of our hearts and souls and bodies to a full participation in the life of today, to my endless surprise, still seems for the very, very few. I'm talking two utterly irreconcilable visions of a genuine work of poetic genius, folks. One endlessly complicated and complicating, the other poetically simple and straightforward, as hard as that is to believe when considering such a seemingly daunting experience as Ulysses. But okay, I've chosen to title this video Stephen, the Hero of Ulysses. For those of you unaware of the reference, Stephen Hero was the title of a body of work rumored to be as much as 1,000 pages long. Joyce wrote sometime between the years 1900 to about 1904 or 1905. It was a story of his life and struggles toward integrity and artistry up to that time, about his 22nd year. However, submitted and rejected by as many as 20 publishers, Joyce supposedly threw the bulky manuscript into the fire in a fit of despair. Apparently his sister Eileen rescued it, or part of it at any rate. Anyway, fragments of Stephen Hero, along with new writings, were eventually cobbled together to produce the much more publishable A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which didn't actually appear until the year 1916, 2 years after he had begun the writing of Ulysses. Now the timeline is important here, folks, for a deeper understanding of what's really happening in Ulysses, beneath or behind the Homeric parallel screen. You have a 1,000-page manuscript Joyce poured his early efforts into, deeply autobiographical, recounting his struggles up to the age of approximately 20 or 22. It would take 10 years of hardship, cutting, and compromise before a severely edited, Baudelarized version, more patchwork quilt than smooth and seamless narrative, would appear with the title we're all familiar with, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This edition of Stephen Hero, which I only chanced upon recently, portrays Joyce's life in his first year of university when he was about 19 or 20 years old, approximately 2 years before we meet him again in the pages of Ulysses. It overlaps the final chapter of A Portrait, and reading it after so many years and a number of passes at A Portrait, I was shocked at how straightforward the text is compared to his other major works. Straightforward, honest, open, and as a result, totally blasphemous and utterly unpublishable back in the day. Scholarship calls it unfinished, immature, inartistic, all shortcomings which would of course have been addressed in the editing process had it managed to be accepted for publication. But as a result of it not making it past the censors to publication, it hasn't been included in the Joyce canon of major published works, starting with Dubliners and moving through A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and then to his two masterpieces, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. However, what if, and this is a big what if, The things the young James Joyce was striving to convey in Stephen Hero were actually what he wanted to say, what he needed to say, again in a straightforward, honest manner, but he quickly learned he wasn't and would never be allowed to say. What if Stephen Hero is the book he wanted to publish, but couldn't, and had to settle for the cut-to-pieces pastiche that is A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man? And what if the true lesson he derived from the entire 1,000-page debacle of Stephen Hero, and its eventual cutting, Baudelarizing, and neutering into the far more acceptable, if sketchy, A Portrait, was a simple fact of what he could and couldn't get away with, and how he would henceforth be forced to hide or disguise his true intentions through art. Here, let me read to you from Stephen Hero. This first bit is just to set the tone, you might say. No one would listen to his theories. No one was interested in art. The young men in the college regarded art as a continental vice, and they said in effect, if we must have art, are there not enough subjects in Holy Writ? Now remember the quote I headed this video with. Stephen did not attach himself to art in any spirit of youthful dilettantism, but strove to pierce to the significant heart of everything. I called that the artist's credo, and at the same time his cross. Now why cross, you might ask? And I would answer, in all probability you cannot begin to understand. Only a very, very few will. As I've repeatedly said, Dedalusday is for the few. Read Thomas Mann's Tonio Kruger, or virtually all the works of Hermann Hesse, or Hesse, whatever you want to call him. Read Henry Miller's Tropic of Capricorn, or his Rosy Crucifixion trilogy. Or here, let me read to you from a letter written by another young man, another young would-be poet, shaman artist. The letter is dated 1870, a little more than 30 years before James Joyce's alter ego, Stephen Dedalus, would traverse his own dark wood. The letter goes, I want to be a poet, and I'm working to make myself a seer. You won't begin to understand, and I almost can't explain it to you. The thing is to arrive at the unknown by a disordering of all the senses. The suffering is enormous, but you have to be strong to be born a poet. I've recognized I'm a poet. It's not at all my fault. It's false to say I think. One ought to say I am thought. Forgive the play on words. It's very zen, that. I is somebody else. Tough luck on the wood that finds it's a violin, and to hell with the people who don't think, who quibble over things they know nothing about. Bear with me here, folks. Listen to these fantastic lines written by a young man not yet 17 years of age. They could have been written by Joyce or spoken by Stephen Dedalus on the role of the artist, on language, and remember Joyce's utterances, his experiments in the latter half of Ulysses, and of course in Finnegan's Wake, and on Woman and Molly Bloom. Listen to the young man's words. Thus the poet is truly a stealer of fire. He is entrusted with humankind, with the animals even. He must make his inventions so that they can be felt, fingered, listened to. If what he brings back from over there has form, he gives form. If it's formless, he gives formlessness. To find a language. For the rest, every utterance being an idea, the day of a universal language will come. You need to be an academician, can't even say that word, deader than a fossil to complete a dictionary of any language at all. Weak minds would start thinking about the first letter of the alphabet, who could soon be careering off into madness. This language will be of the soul for the soul, summing up everything, perfumes, sounds, colors, thought, latching on to thought and pulling. The poet would define the amount of the unknown awakening in his time in the universal soul. He would give more than the formula of its thought, than the notation of its march to progress. Enormity becoming the norm, absorbed by all, he would truly be a multiplier of progress. That future will be materialist. You can see it, almost always full of number and of harmony. These poems will be made to remain. Basically, it would be a bit like Greek poetry again. Eternal art would have its functions. Inasmuch as poets are citizens, poetry will no longer give rhythm to the action. It will be out ahead of it. These poets will be. Once the infinite servitude of woman is shattered, once she lives for herself and through herself, man, abominable up until now, having given her her discharge, she too will be a poet. Women will find the unknown. Will her words of ideas differ from our own? She will find strange, unfathomable, repellent, delightful things. We shall take them. We shall understand them. Meanwhile, let us ask poets for the new ideas and forms. All the clever ones would quickly believe they had satisfied this demand. But that's not it. Those are the amazing words of Arthur Rimbaud, aged 16 and a half, who never really stood a chance of making a dime off his writings or poetry. By his early 20s, he will have given up entirely on art and poetry and sailed off to Africa to make his fortune in the colonies. Let me share with you one last word of the once poet Arthur Rimbaud, mired in the sweltering heat and crushing solitude of Africa. He writes, "For myself, I regret not being married and having a family, but at the present I am condemned to wander, tied to a distant enterprise, and every day I lose my liking for the climate and the way of life, and even the language of Europe. Alas, what's the point of these comings and goings, the fatigue and the adventures among strange races, the languages one fills one's memory with, the nameless difficulties, if I'm not one day, after a few years, to be able to settle down myself in a place I more or less like, and find a family, and having at least one son who I can spend the rest of my life raising according to my own ideas, decking him out and arming him with the most complete education that is to be attained in the present age." That line, "one son who I can spend the rest of my life raising according to my own ideas," reminds me of Bloom's dilemma, having lost his only son Rudy, who he could have, as he put it, raised to be independent. Anyhow, let's return to Stephen Hero and the struggles of the young James Joyce. Listen to Stephen's thoughts on the artist. He thinks, "The poet is the intense center of the life of his age, to which he stands in a relation than which none can be more vital. He alone is capable of absorbing in himself the life that surrounds him and of flinging it abroad again amid planetary music. When the poetic phenomenon is signaled in the heavens," exclaimed this heaven-ascending essayist, "it is time for the critics to verify their calculations in accordance with it. It is time for them to acknowledge that here the imagination has contemplated intensely the truth of the being of the visible world, and that beauty, the splendor of truth, has been born. The age, though it bury itself fathoms deep in formulas and machinery, has need of these realities which alone give and sustain life, and it must await from those chosen centers of vivification the force to live, the security for life which can come to it only from them. Thus the spirit of man makes a continual affirmation." Do you see or hear the similarities with Rimbaud? And similar to Rimbaud, how does the young James Joyce navigate a world which has no interest in hearing anything he truly has to say? And remember, this is Stephen/Joyce about 2 years before the action of June 16th, 1904, Dedalusday, will take place. In Stephen Hero, far more than the patchwork, a portrait, we clearly see the young Joyce in his isolation at home, amidst his family, on the streets, and in the homes of the priest-ridden Dublin, and amongst his fellow students at the university. As we read early in the text, Stephen came seldom to lectures, prepared nothing, and absented himself from term and examinations, and not merely was no remark passed on these extravagances, but it was supposed probable that he represented really the artistic type, and that he was, after the fashion of that little-known tribe, educating himself. Who has the courage these days to educate themselves? I'll leave you to explore his isolation in Stephen Hero further, but I want to finish this video setting up the young Stephen/Joyce's situation, where he's at in his psycho-spiritual gestation towards birth as the fully mature artist/shaman, with one of the most crucial relationships in a young man, any young man's life, that is, his relationship with women, the young women of his day and age. Now, a portrait of the artist is virtually silent on this absolutely key development in a young man's life. Sure, he's had an early experience with a prostitute, and towards the end, Stephen's soul is overborne at the sight of a young woman strolling barefoot in a flowing stream. But the former was sordid and cold, while the latter was more an artistic, poetic instant of ecstasy. What I'm talking about here is the real thing. A real, living, breathing, warm-blooded physical attraction with a young woman. However, in Stephen Hero, we see the young Joyce / Dedalus's brief and ultimately frustrating relationship with a young Irish lassie named Emma Clery. Here he is, at an innocent little soiree, witnessing a mild flirtation between Emma and a priest. Goes, Stephen, watching this young priest and Emma together, usually worked himself into a state of unsettled rage. It was not so much that he suffered personally as that the spectacle seemed to him typical of Irish ineffectualness. Often he felt his fingers itch. Father Moran's eyes were so clear and tender-looking. Emma stood to his gaze in such a poise of bold, careless pride of the flesh that Stephen longed to precipitate the two into each other's arms and shock the room, even though he knew the pain this impersonal generosity would cause himself. I love that. Precipitate the two into each other's arms with impersonal generosity. However, there's no chance of that making it past the censors back then, is there? Or how about this? He would have liked nothing so well as an adventure with her now, but he felt that even that warm, ample body could hardly compensate him for her distressing pertness and middle-class affectations. Not going to get that one past the censors back then. And lastly, let me share with you their final meeting. Stephen has been in yet another abysmal language class in the cold, cloistral corridors of the damp old university when he spies Emma walking outside. This one's a bit of a long one, but I really think it sets the stage for the Stephen Dedalus we meet again in Ulysses. And Stephen Hero goes, with a flying hand for the banisters, he ran down the stairs, taking 5 steps at a time. Outside the university, he came alongside the object which he had been pursuing. Good morning. Stephen! Have you been running? Yes. Where are you going to? I saw you from the window. What window? In the college. Where are you going? I'm going to Leeson Park. This way, Stephen said, taking her arm. She seemed as if she were about to resent such an act in broad daylight, but after a quick glance of remonstrance, allowed him to escort her. Stephen held her arm tightly to his side and discomposed her somewhat by speaking very close to her face. Her face was glistening with mist, and it had begun to glow in answer to his excited and passionate manner. Where did you see me? I was in the window at my Italian lesson with Father Artifoni. I saw you come through the green and cross the road. Did you? So I jumped up at once and asked him to excuse me, as I had to keep an appointment, and flew downstairs and out after you. The color had begun to deepen very much on her cheek, and it was plain that she was trying to appear quite at her ease. At first she had been flattered, but now she was becoming a little nervous. She laughed nervously when he told her why that he had run out after her. It's a little unclear. Occasionally there's a little crossed out lines here. Goodness, why did you do that? Stephen did not answer, but he pressed her arm fiercely to his side. At the end of the terrace, she turned into a side street instinctively. Here she walked more slowly. The street was very quiet, and they both lowered their voices. How did you know it was I? She said. You must have good sight. I was gazing out of the window, he answered, looking at the sky and the green. Lord God, I felt so full of despair. Sometimes I am taken that way. I live such a strange life. Listen to this. I live such a strange life, without help or sympathy from anyone. Sometimes I am afraid of myself. I call those people in the college not men, but vegetables. Then while I was cursing my own character, I saw you. Yes? She said, looking at the disorderly figure beside her out of her large and oval eyes. You know I was delighted to see you. I had to jump up and rush out. I couldn't have sat there another minute. I said, here's a human creature at last. I can't tell you how delighted I was. You strange boy, she said. You mustn't go running about like that. You must have more sense. Emma, cried Stephen, don't start talking to me like that today. I know you want to be very sensible, but you and I, we are both young, aren't we? Yes, Stephen. Very good then. If we're young, we feel happy. We feel full of desire. Desire? Do you know when I saw you? Yes, how did you know me? I knew the stride. Stride? Do you know, Emma, even from my window I could see your hips moving inside your waterproof. I saw a young woman walking proudly through the decayed city. Yes, that's the way you walk. You're proud of being young and proud of being a woman. Do you know when I caught sight of you from my window? Do you know what I felt? There was no use in her assaying indifference now. Her cheeks were covered with a persistent flush, and her eyes shone like gems. She gazed straight before her, and her breath began to be agitated. They stood together in the deserted street, and he continued speaking, a certain ingenuous disattachment guiding his excited passion. I felt that I longed to hold you in my arms, your body. I longed for you to take me in your arms. That's all. Then I thought I would run after you and say that to you. Just to live one night together, Emma, and then to say goodbye in the morning and never to see each other again. There's no such thing as love in the world. Only people are young. She tried to take her arm away from his and murmured as if she were repeating from memory, "You are mad, Stephen." Stephen let her arm go and took her hand in his, saying, "Goodbye, Emma. I felt that I wanted to say that to you for my own sake. But if I stand here in this stupid street beside you for much longer, I shall begin to say more. You say I'm mad because I do not bargain with you, or say I love you, or swear to you, but I believe you hear my words and understand me. Don't you?" "I don't understand you indeed," she answered with a touch of anger. "I will give you a chance," said Stephen, pressing her hand close to in his two hands. "Tonight, when you are going to bed, remember me and go to your window. I will be in the garden. Open the window and call my name and ask me to come in. Then come down and let me in. We will live one night together. One night, Emma. Alone together, and in the morning we will say goodbye." "Let go my hand, please," she said, pulling her hand away from him. "If I had known it was for this mad talk, you must not speak to me any more," she said, moving on a pace or two and plucking her waterproof out of his reach. "Who do you think I am that you can speak to me like that?" "It's no insult," said Stephen, colouring suddenly as the reverse of the image struck him, "for a man to ask a woman what I've asked you. You are annoyed at something else, not at that." "You are mad, I think," she said, brushing past him swiftly without taking any notice of his salute. She did not go quickly enough, however, to hide the tears that were in her eyes, and he, surprised to see them and wondering at their cause, forgot to say the goodbye that was on his lips. As he watched her walk onwards swiftly, with her head slightly bowed, he seemed to feel her soul and his falling asunder swiftly and forever after an instant of all but union. "I live such a strange life, without help or sympathy from anyone," pleads Stephen. And he doesn't get any help or sympathy from Emma. And that, folks, is the genuine artist's cross. However, the real striving artist, Stephen Dedalus, that is James Joyce, did find that woman. Her name was Nora Barnacle, and undoubtedly Molly Bloom was modelled upon her. Listen to how Joseph Campbell put it in his creative mythology. My dog-eared version here. The appointment was made, Richard Ellman tells in his biography of Joyce, and for the evening of June 16th, when they went walking out at Ring's End, and thereafter began to meet regularly. To set Ulysses on this date was Joyce's most eloquent if indirect tribute to Nora, a recognition of the determining effect upon his life of his attachment to her. Listen to this. On June 16th, he entered into relation with the world around him and left behind him the loneliness he had felt since his mother's death. I'll read that again. On June 16th, he entered into relation with the world around him and left behind him the loneliness he had felt since his mother's death. He would tell her later, "You made me a man." June 16th was the sacred day that divided, and I would add, joined, Stephen Dedalus, the insurgent youth, with Leopold Bloom, the complacent husband. So there you have it, folks. Just associations, never anything concrete. Here at the Omphalos Cafe, we leave the concrete for academia. However, you want to know in a nutshell what Ulysses is about? Ulysses is the continuation and culmination of Joyce's development that began with Stephen Hero. Following the whole Stephen Hero, A Portrait Debacle, he had to figure out a way to continue his story, his retreat, separation or detachment from the value system of Dublin, Ireland, and indeed of all Europe, without being critical of it. He had to find out or figure out a way to depict his death to that old way of life and rebirth as an artist without offending that old way and thus assuring its unpublishability. And he did, with one of his greatest creations, Leopold Bloom. Uncritical Bloom, no longer Jewish, no longer Christian, beyond both of those isms, beyond nationalism, beyond capitalism. Being a mere advertising canvasser, Bloom is a free agent, a wanderer in the city without status, an outsider without a vested role in the maintenance or upkeep of the city or nation, its values, its system of sentiments. Bloom is all those things, as well as that one friend and sympathetic ear for the maturing artist, Stephen Dedalus. And that's it. Okay, visitors to the Omphalos Cafe, I'm almost done here, but since we're talking nutshells, I'll go one step further. I mean, academics can talk for hours and hours, day after day, week after week, but they never come close to the heart of the matter here. Like I said, it's all part of the sickness and paralytic plight of our age. But I'll tell you in less than a minute what Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are actually about. At one point in Stephen Hero, but not a portrait of the artist as a young man, mind you, for obvious reasons, Stephen thinks to himself, it was people like me who created the ritual and ceremony of the Roman Catholic Church. That is, it was genuine artists, poets, shamans like Stephen and James Joyce who, to meet the deep psycho-spiritual needs and cravings of the people of the day, and we're talking 1,000 to 1,500 years ago now, people like him created the ceremony and ritual of the Roman Catholic Church. However, today those rituals and ceremonies no longer serve the needs and cravings of us, of you, me, and humankind in general in our modern world. Joyce recognized that fact, and he recognized it 100 years ago, and he recognized that we, you, me, and all humanity need transcend, move beyond Catholicism, Christianity. We need move beyond Judaism, Islam, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, in fact any and all isms, to life. Ulysses in a nutshell is the story of Stephen/James Joyce getting to that place beyond the isms that continue to hinder our growth towards an awakened relationship with life, folks. And Finnegan's Wake is the book Joyce wrote from that place. It's that simple. And what did that take? 60, 65 seconds? You've been watching the Omphalos Cafe. Thanks for dropping by, and we'll see you next time. As I never tire of saying, life truly is all there is. Thanks again.